I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, everyone. Today, we are talking all things couples therapy. Recently, I got into the couples therapy show on Showtime, and I've been obsessed. It's my nighttime eating dinner, watching TV show, and I've blown through almost 3 seasons. I highly encouraged Lucy to check out the show as well, and you watched it with your husband, Lucy.
Yeah, he actually got hooked even before me. We watched episode 1 of season 1, and he was like, how do I binge this whole season? He was obsessed.
I love it. So this show is really interesting to me because I have gone to couples therapy before, and I found the way that I experienced couples therapy and what I was seeing on the show was like super different. And you always wonder how other couples are going through the process. Like, are they fighting as much as I was? Or like, are they crying? Like, what is the dynamic here? So just that little glimpse got me really interested in like, what are the types of couples therapy out there? How do you know when it's time to go? How many people are even doing this? And from a broader perspective, what do people actually learn from it? And what can we learn ourselves from watching the show, from listening to these really popular couples therapists and implement it in our own relationships?
Yes, I personally have not had experience with couples therapy. I actually don't even have real therapy in general experience. It's something I've been wanting to do for myself, but I mean, obviously the barriers are like, one, cost.
Totally.
Not a lot of therapy is like covered by my insurance. And I find that the ones where I've actually done the research and like looked into it, I'm just not super impressed with the providers out there that my insurance does cover. And I've gone to a couple like one-off sessions, but no one's ever really made it past 3 sessions. Like I just never feel like I click with the person. As someone who's never been through like the actual therapy process, it was super eye-opening to watch them over the course of several weeks. I mean, some background on the show, couples therapy. One, like, what a crazy concept. Who the hell would sign up to do this? I just got to imagine, like, I know they don't release their last names, but obviously the people in their lives would know it's them. And all of a sudden know, like, all of these really intimate details about your relationship.
But people are going to recognize you, too.
Yeah.
It's like a reality TV show. There's a subreddit. People talk about it. There's articles. I mean, Call Her Daddy even just had Orna, the therapist, on her show. Mm-hmm. So you are a recognizable person now, just like you would be on like
Totally.
The Bachelorette or something. I was so curious if the dynamic of knowing that you're going to be on national television changes how you show up in couples therapy.
Yeah.
How are you truly showing all the ugly parts of yourself knowing the country is watching? That is some pressure. Like it's hard enough to do it in front of the therapist and in front of your partner, but my God, when you have cameras on you. And there's an article in The New Yorker that talks about this. And actually, the New York Times did a profile on one of the couples, too, from season 3, how they even got on the show and how they source couples. And it really is just people Googling, I need to go to couples therapy, or like a friend of theirs who knows that they're looking for a couples therapist will send them the application link. And Orna, the therapist, charges $700 a session. And then you get 18 to 22 free sessions. So that right there is like ridiculous value.
Tremendous value. Yeah.
And they film 6 couples over the course of the season and cut 2 of the storylines out. So the couples go into it hoping that they're going to be the storyline that gets cut out. And they're like, the gamble's worth it.
Oh, okay. So then they just get free therapy. Yeah. And they didn't get any of the exposure concerns.
Yep.
I feel like you low-key go in being like, oh, like I'm just a totally rational, sensible person. Like there's not going to be enough drama for them to want to feature my storyline.
Obviously, it's my partner who's the problem too. So the world's going to see that.
Right. Like they're going to be the villain and I'm not.
Yeah. Well, one of the couples from season 1 who they interviewed said they actually really liked the fact that it was filmed because they could go back and watch it and kind of solidify their issues. Like the husband had gone in thinking that this was the end of the relationship. Like he was really ready to be out. They ended up resolving their issues and they said they go back and watch their season to learn from now when they have problems.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, that's so interesting because some of the research I did was on the efficacy of couples therapy and if it really gives you the outcomes that you're looking for. And I don't think this is going to be that much of a spoiler for people, but like, yes, couples therapy is effective. Now, effective obviously means many things. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to stay together if you're in a bad relationship.
Yeah.
But they have found that like over time, the benefits of couple therapy dissipate. So like over the course of several years, you actually see less of the positive effects. But that's probably just because like, you're not like revisiting those lessons all the time. When it's fresh in your mind, you have the techniques and you're like really motivated to apply those things.
Yeah.
It's easier to see the positive behavioral changes, but then it's easy also to fall back into old patterns, you know?
Yeah, totally.
The New Yorker article that you referenced about the show, you sent it to me and I read it. And the woman who wrote it, Alexandra Schwartz, she asks Orna about this idea of being in therapy, but also being on TV, what she thinks of the process. And of course, Orna doesn't source the couples. They just kind of come to her through the production team. But she said that she thinks of documentary and therapy as two sides of the same coin, which I thought was really interesting. And actually, I dug into Orna's background a bit, and she studied film in college.
Yeah.
So she was like the perfect person for this. But Orna's quote is, "Everyone's trying to grasp what is the actual story here? What is the truth? What is going on?" in both therapy and documentary. And the answer, if there is one, implicates not just her patients, but herself. She says, just reflecting upon herself being a therapist, where her work is being shown to the world, that it's made her feel more accountable for her work. You can't hide behind jargon. You can't refer to other people's theories. You just have to say what you mean.
Oh, I love that. I think that's what makes her so effective too, because she's not using all of this jargon and like over explaining.
Totally. Because like what you said about your personal experience doing couples therapy and how that differed a lot from the show, like I wonder, obviously it depends on the therapist, but I also wonder if she obviously knows she's performing as well, and if she's changing her style for the TV audience, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, in my experience in couples therapy, like the therapist would explicitly say, like, this is a theory from so-and-so, and like, this is how it works, and this is how it's playing out right now. Like, it was very intellectualized. And interestingly enough, some of the stuff that she referenced was Virginia Goldner's work, who is Orna's clinical advisor.
Yeah, I mean, but Orna doesn't do any of that, and yet she has such gravitas.
Yes.
And now that I'm like learning more about couples therapy through the process of doing research for this episode, like learning about the different types of therapy, I'm like starting to pull together the threads of like, oh, like that's what she's doing. And she's doing this here. But it feels so organic, so natural. She's just such a good listener. And like, it feels like she knows exactly what to say when the couple in front of her is like having a crisis.
Yeah.
And it's incredible how good she is at her job.
Totally.
The other thing I thought was really interesting from the article is that she is the one who suggested to make her clinical advisor part of the show. And I feel like that also makes me more of a fan, because you see her being vulnerable and like not knowing all the answers too.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like if they didn't have those scenes, she would just come off as almost like not human.
Yeah.
Like she has all the answers in a way, and she's kind of sitting there with this bigger picture that like we as normal humans who aren't trained don't have access to. And then I think seeing her reflecting on her sessions, and then also sometimes like empathizing with the couples, which is not something you would ever tell a patient, but like is something you could talk to an advisor about.
Yeah. And I love that we get the glimpse into what she's actually feeling. Because there's one couple in season 1 specifically where the guy is so clearly a narcissist and the wife is in crisis.
Mel.
Yeah, Mel. And she does a really good job of playing it off like she's on both of their teams. And you're like, does she not see how toxic this guy is? And then you go into the clinical advisor section of the show, then you get that reflection of like, okay, how is she working through that, knowing that he has fired 4 couples therapists before and is like sort of manipulating him into staying into couples therapy in a way.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, okay, to end the fangirling about Orna for a sec, let's go into the rest of the conversation.
The shape of our conversation today, we've got 2 halves for you. The first half, we're going to go pretty deep into couples therapy in general, the efficacy, what types of therapy there are, when you know it's time to go, and like what you can expect from it. Like what are the things that you can change versus what can you not really expect to change from couples therapy? And then the second half of our conversation, we're going to look at some popular couples therapists. So Lucy, you're going to give us some advice from Orna Guralnik and Virginia Goldner. And then I'm going to give us some advice from Esther Perel, who is, of course, the host of Where Should We Begin podcast, and from Terry Real, who is a celebrity couples therapist.
Amazing, yes. So the first thing I looked at was, what are the statistics on couples therapy? And there's actually not a ton of surveys on this. A survey that was done by this mental health publication called Very Well Mind in 2023 had 1,100 cohabitating adults take the survey. So of that group, 37% had been to couples therapy at some point, and 10% were currently in couples therapy. And they asked them a whole bunch of questions about their experiences, and 76% of those people who'd been to couples therapy said that they ranked couples therapy as having a high or very high impact, and 94% said it was worth the investment.
Wow.
So
very high approval rating.
Couples therapy is expensive, yeah, and people definitely think it's worth it. One thing I thought was interesting is 35% said they started couples therapy before moving in together. So people are doing this pretty early on. I consider personally moving in together as like a pretty major early milestone, but like before that, I kind of think you're just kind of dating. Like, it feels more casual to me.
Yeah.
And so I was surprised that like 1/3 of people are starting that early.
Yeah.
I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
Well, it kind of gets into my topic of when is the right time to go to therapy. So I'll hold off on commentary, but yes, it does resonate.
So even though like most couples report that they're very satisfied with their experience in couples therapy, and also these surveys revealed that 68% of cohabitating couples and 88% of those already in couples therapy feel that it is best to start couples therapy before there are serious problems. So almost as like a preventative or just like a health related step in your relationship before there becomes like the potential for divorce.
Yeah.
Why aren't more people going? And obviously there's like clear barriers. So one is just the expense. I mean, Orna and her $700 an hour fee is like one example.
Could you imagine?
That's insane, yeah.
You go once a week and you're spending far more than your mortgage probably.
In these surveys, they were finding that the average cost of couples therapy for people was around $300 per month, but still a significant expense. 32% said it was because their partner didn't want to.
I've like heard this be a problem before with like people I know. Actually, Terry Real, one of the therapists I'm going to talk about, the celebrity therapist, he said that if he had a nickel for every time a man didn't want to come in, but the woman did, he would be able to retire. Let's see, that's so funny.
Yeah. And then lastly, amongst people in couples therapy, 1 in 3 said it was difficult to find a therapist. So I feel like that
that's really high.
Resonates with my own experience. Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
I think it's just so hard to find the right fit. Orna talks about this as well. It takes time. She says it takes 3 months. On the Call Her Daddy podcast, she is talking to Alex Cooper, and she's like, yeah, typically around 3 months, people hit an inflection where it's like they finally trust their therapist and can actually get into the interesting things. Because in the early days, and I struggle with this, because in my personal experience with therapy, I always felt like I didn't have much to talk about, or like I would only talk about things that I kind of already figured out for myself. And therefore, I would leave the session being like, I didn't learn anything new. It was kind of a waste of time and money.
Yep.
And it takes a long time to like build a bond with the therapist where you can then actually go into unknown places that you yourself don't even realize.
Yeah, absolutely. I've totally felt this in my life because I do go to individual therapy and I love my therapist now, but I think I've gone through 4 therapists, like he's my 4th. And the other ones I did not get any real value out of at all. And I felt that exact same way. I was like, I'm just coming here and like either we're just staring at each other because you're not asking me any questions, or I'm just saying nothing. And it just felt very awkward. But my therapist now, I love him. He's wonderful. But yeah, it does take some trial and error there. And it's so hard when these sessions are so expensive, especially when you're doing couples therapy. Like you're dishing out hundreds of dollars just to like find a right fit. And I think there's this mythos too that, you know, you're going to go in and have like 2 or 3 sessions and your problems are going to be resolved. But you really have to be ready to like buckle down for the long haul. And yeah, you don't get into the interesting stuff until kind of all that surface level junk is brought up and the therapist knows you and you know them. And then you can really get into like what Orna calls the real work.
Yeah. Most of the time, these therapists have programs that are like, this will take 20 weeks. And they'll tell you that up front, which is like crazy, the amount of commitment that takes up front.
Well, when you do decide it's time to go to therapy, how can you know when it is time? Because a lot of these problems that people end up going to therapy for are huge life stressor things that you don't even encounter until you're really deep into the relationship, like infidelity, kids, financial stressors. And the Gottman Institute echoes what you had said previously, that the best intervention is prevention. So they do encourage premarital counseling, even if you're happy. Like just go to couples counseling before you get married. Try to like anticipate what the problems are going to be. And they also recommend that you go to either annual or biannual couples checkup counseling sessions where you just go, even if you're just happy, just to kind of check in with each other.
I feel like that's such an unrealistic recommendation, though. Of course, they're going to say that because, I mean, my skeptical hat is like, they want business. They want more people in couples therapy. But then also, like, it's like the vitamin thing. Obviously, you should think about your health, exercise, eat well before it becomes an issue. But it's so hard to do that because we're human and we deal with a problem when it's in front of us. It's very hard for us to like do all the preventative actions. It just goes against human nature.
Yeah, totally. But I thought, not to keep referencing this New Yorker article, I feel like everyone should just read that. But at the beginning, the producers of the couples therapy show, they're Jewish, and they talk about how in their communities, it's so common to go to couples therapy. It's like your car needs a tune-up. You just go to the mechanic. It's like, oh, we're having issues. Let's just go to the couples therapist. And so there's, I think, a different attitude, especially depending on your community. like the East Coast Jewish community is just like, yeah, whatever, go to couples therapy. It's part of normal life. Whereas like maybe in some communities with other mindsets, you're like, oh no, it has to be like really serious before you do that. But I think all the advice is pointing to
They're also really rich. Like they come from rich
families. Absolutely. But yeah, there's so many other ways to like do counseling that's like not actually going to counseling now. Like even Esther Perel has an online course that you can do with your partner. And I was seeing on Reddit that people had a lot of success with this. So that's one way to do it. A lot of these people also have books and like workbooks that you can do with your partner. So there are other options thanks to the internet now. But yeah, it is a privilege to be able to dish out the few $100s per session for these couples therapists.
My husband and I, we do relationship check-ins every month, but it's just like with us, not a person we're paying necessarily to listen to us. Maybe people overhearing in a coffee shop, inadvertently listening.
Well, not all of us are so blessed, Lucy. No, I'm just kidding.
So simple.
So blessed to be able to like just handle it yourselves.
Well, this is what I mean for like the preventative stuff. We have it every month so that we force ourselves to talk about like, what are the 3 things that are going well? What are the 3 things that are not going so well? And we basically give each other feedback. It's kind of like a work, like a colleague relationship.
Oh, you're such a consultant.
I know. But then I feel like nothing really becomes that crazy of a thing because you are talking about it every month, you know?
Does it feel confronting to do that?
No, because I think like the benefit of structure is it takes the fear and burden out of difficult conversations. If every month you know you're going to have the conversation, then no one has to bring it up and be like, I think we have an issue. We should talk about it. It's just like automatically on the calendar. And it forces you to reflect, even if there was nothing that I'm like, wow, I really need to talk to Avery about this, bring it to our check-in. I mean, that never happens because I'll just like talk to him immediately. But I find that because I have the time blocked out, it makes me reflect and think about things that maybe I would have never brought up and I didn't even realize were potentially things that we could improve, but just because we have the space for it.
That's so healthy.
I mean, they say like a lot of sex therapists recommend that you just like every year talk about if you should open the marriage.
Really?
As like a standard thing, yeah, because then nobody has to bring it up. Because often like part of the issue with the question of opening your marriage is like the person who brings it up has more of the power because obviously they were the ones seemingly more interested and that's when they even brought the conversation to the table.
Right.
But if you have like a yearly set of questions, I mean, obviously opening the marriage is just one example, but it could be about your finances, it could be about kids, it could be whatever major discussions that are challenging to have if you just have the time for it and then nobody has to bring it up. There's less pressure or stigma associated with it.
That's a really interesting way to do that. I mean, I think that's a really, really healthy route to go, especially a good alternative to the annual check-in.
Yeah, well, I imagine like probably if you are going to therapy regularly, your therapist is also helping you do this essentially through them. But yeah, I'm curious, what did you find in terms of at what point are people like, should they really be going to therapy because they do need outside help? Because obviously it is different to just like try to resolve things yourself versus having a professional guide you through.
Yeah, absolutely. So what more often than not happens is people go in when they're on the brink. They're talking about separation or divorce, and it does become like this last ditch effort thing. And when you go in at that point, it is much less successful than if you go in when you recognize that you have the problem. And of course, the difficulty is saying, is this a problem that we need counseling for, or is this something that we can resolve on our own? And obviously that takes discretion. But what you really want to look for, what are these like more foundational, fundamental issues that keep rearing their heads? It causes huge explosive fights or emotional distance whenever this is brought up. And we've tried X number of times to talk about this and it's just not going anywhere. Oftentimes over the course of years, your story gets entrenched. And so by the time you go into couples therapy, it's really hard to untangle all of the years of resentment and the story behind it and dissolve it. And it's that dissolution of the emotion and the resentment that you're really trying to get out of couples therapy, in addition to learning how to work through the problem and see each other better. There were stories I was reading, even my own therapist has told me stories about couples, because he's a couples therapist as well, couples that come in after 30 years of having the same issue. And he's like, wow, I've really got my work cut out for me with this one, right? So so much better to go in sooner. The average couple waits 6 years after the problem rears its head to go into couples therapy, in part due to the stigma that we were talking about before, like the belief that it signals a weakness in your relationship and like it's a shame game thing. Like you think you should be able to resolve it on your own. But it is so normal not to have the tools to be able to do that. And these are skills that like everyone can learn. So you just need to give yourself the space, and it's not shameful to go. Some telltale signs, if you're like, I don't really know if this is the problem that I want to go into therapy for. You can start looking at if there's a lack of sexual intimacy, like you feel so emotionally distant that it's not only creating like the sexual intimacy issue, but like intimacy in your household or tension. If you feel like you're falling out of love, like you're like, I love you, but I'm not in love with you, that can actually be reignited in couples therapy. So they say, which is fascinating. Or if you have stressors due to life, like your in-laws, kids, work, or household responsibilities, they actually recommend that you don't try to solve those on your own, because these are ones that more often than not are perpetual.
Interesting.
So this also begs the question, like, when should you not go to couples therapy?
Like, when should you give up?
Well,
or like, when are you healthy?
Yeah, I guess both. Like, I was interested in this idea because it's like, okay, obviously everyone's going to tell you if you have an issue and like you want to go, you should just go, right? But like,
totally.
Then the inverse of that is like, when should you not go? And this information is hard to find, but like what I was able to gather is obviously don't go if like one partner is not willing to participate. Like, you're just completely wasting your time. Like, a lot of therapists will say that like one person will drag the other partner in when they don't really want to go. But what ends up happening is they're just sitting there, not actually participating in the therapy. And it's a waste of everyone's time.
Yeah, like you can't force people to go to therapy. They have to be like ready and willing to take that step on their own.
Exactly. The second time you shouldn't go is if you've been dating for a short amount of time. So with the destigmatization of therapy, therapists are seeing couples who have only been dating for a few weeks or a few months show up in couples therapy.
Oh my God, imagine a few weeks.
Yeah. And they were like, if you're seeing problems before like the 1 year mark like this and you want to go to therapy, try to seek individual therapy first, because it's more likely a problem with one of you individually and not the dynamic. And also fundamental issues so early on probably indicate that the relationship won't be successful anyway. So maybe just hold off on that.
That is useful because I feel like people, well, there's obviously the honeymoon phase, right? Which we talked about in our love, matchmaking, and monogamy episode in terms of the science behind the honeymoon phase. But like, there's so much fluctuation that happens in the first year between the honeymoon phase, they come down from that, experiencing life together, many new firsts. It's kind of hard to figure out like what is your actual dynamic as a couple. And so I think that is useful to know, because I do feel like nowadays the narrative is just like very mental health aware and like therapy is always a good thing. But the reality is like, if you don't even have enough self-awareness yet as a couple to even like know how you function, I could imagine going to therapy being quite confusing because you don't have any behaviors, you don't have any patterns or systems maybe yet, like you're still developing those things.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's not like, oh, you have problems in your relationship that's just starting out or like less than a year, like you should just break up. The advice is go to individual therapy. And I think that is actually really good advice. You're probably bringing something into the dynamic that like, it's not the relationship that is necessarily the problem at that point. It's an individual problem because the relationship hasn't had enough time, to your point, to be entrenched in these patterns that need disrupting. So the third time when you should not go is if there's any presence of domestic violence. So not only is it not advised to go just because the answer is always just make a plan for safe escape, but it can actually put the victim at greater risk of abuse to show up to couples therapy. So it's just a complete no-go.
I think that's one of the situations where like a professional can break patient-doctor confidentiality.
Yes.
Is if there's risk of harm to you or someone else.
Yeah.
So the advice in that situation is you just get yourself into a physically safe space and leave.
Yep.
If you can.
You have to. Yeah, because the victim isn't able to actually speak freely in therapy. And if they do, it could just cause more issues at home. And more often than not, that's what happens. Like the abuser is triggered in therapy and the abuse worsens. Like, don't try to fix that sort of problem, even with a professional. Yeah, so now that we know when not to go, if you do decide to go, if you're in a position where you're like, this could be really good for me, the next question becomes like, how much can I expect to get out of this experience? How effective is it actually? I know, Lucy, you did some research into the efficacy.
Yeah, obviously we saw all the survey responses where people say they're feeling better, but also even in clinical studies, it works. The average person receiving couples therapy is better off at the conclusion of it by 70 to 80% compared to individuals not receiving treatment. And that is a very high rate. It rivals or exceeds the most effective psychosocial and pharmacological interventions for individual mental health disorders. So a lot of the techniques that are used in individual therapy are also approaches that have been applied now to couples therapy. And in general, regardless of the type of couples therapy you're doing, there's sufficient evidence to say that behavioral and non-behavioral therapies seem to have similar rates of impact. I mean, I guess my question really was like, what does it mean to be better off? Because you have all of these studies and people reporting that they're better. But like, what does better mean? And like, does that mean that you don't get a divorce or that you don't break up? And it was pretty hard to actually find data on this. I mean, what I found was that 4 years after couples counseling, 40% of relationships end in divorce. I mean, that's the same divorce rate as first marriages. And to me as well, I would not define better off as necessarily like definitely staying together. From my perspective, going to a couples therapy with your partner that ends in a breakup could still be like very successful for yourself and for them if it was like a relationship that wasn't healthy or wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
So while I think from like a statistics perspective, it's quite hard to tell. Like sometimes people go to couples therapy because they're on that brink. Like you said, they're like trying to avoid a divorce. And there are specific types of therapy designed for that situation where you're coming in a very emotionally heightened state. And the first step is actually just to figure out, is this something you guys should work on, or if you should just split? And then the therapy process is more about making that split productive and amicable for both parties. But I think ultimately, if you're going in with more of a general goal around feeling better emotionally, like breaking out of patterns that are clearly negative for you because they cause you stress, then couples therapy has been found to be like overwhelmingly positive. And even in the survey, they asked people who had gone to therapy in the past but stopped, like, why did you stop? And 66% of people said they stopped because they resolved their issues.
Wow.
Not because it was too expensive or, you know, it was inconvenient or like some other reason. So people are feeling like they're reaching some sort of better place by the end of their therapy.
That is actually surprising. I figured there'd be a lot higher percentage of people who just quit, because they talk about this a lot even in the show Couples Therapy, how usually it's the man who doesn't like the therapist, doesn't think the work is good, and they're jumping around from therapist to therapist. And by the time they get to Orna, she's like, okay, well, I got to tread lightly here. I can't tick him off. And so I feel like it would be more of a pattern that people are like, this is too confronting. I'm going to drop out.
I feel like if you're in a relationship where either you or your partner has been trying, and as we talked about, I think it takes a while to find the right fit. But if you are on your 10th therapist, it's still not working, then maybe the problem is you. And I mean, that's why it's tricky, because like this is all survey data, right? So it really very much depends on like how people are interpreting the question.
Totally.
Like for me, if someone asked me like, did therapy resolve your issue? And if I was in the situation where I had tried several therapists and my partner was out, at that point I'd be like, okay, we're going to break up. That's a resolution. Is it the quote unquote romantic ideal of a relationship? Maybe not, but it is meeting my needs right now. So
Giving you the answer.
yeah.
So it worked.
Yeah. It worked. Yeah. Okay, so this brings us to the types of therapy. I basically looked at like a review paper from 2022 of a lot of different studies kind of trying to summarize essentially the state of couples therapy in 2020, what we know about it. And there have been so many studies published about very specific types of therapy. But in general, the conclusion was like anything helps, really. As long as you're talking to a professional and they are a good fit for you, it can only help. But just even for like my personal knowledge, I feel like when looking for an individual therapist, it was a huge black box in terms of like what I should be looking for. And like a lot of times therapists will say that they practice a specific type of therapy, and the words are all like quite technical, and I just never really knew the difference. I'm curious, is that something when you were looking for your therapist or your couples therapist that you thought about? Like, were you looking for someone who came from a particular school of thought?
Yeah, absolutely. From my failed individual therapy experiences, it was all in CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. More often than not, CBT is what is covered by insurance because it's clinically observable to help depression and anxiety. So, of course, insurance covers it. The problem is that if you are a very logical, in your head type of person, you don't need help thinking through your problems because that's what you're naturally doing. You need help feeling your feelings. And I'm somebody that's like, I can tell you, I already know what my problem is. I already know how to resolve it. I can tell you 50 different ways that I'm looking at this problem. You don't need to help me think through it. You need to help me feel what I'm feeling.
Got it.
So I actually go to a type of therapy now called internal family systems, IFS, and it's wonderful. I love it. And it's more of like, they call it somatic therapy, that's helping you feel and like understand the patterns in your life and your childhood that made you who you are today. So you can recognize how your experiences have shaped who you are and not necessarily trying to think your way out of a problem. So I know that couples therapists, there's so many different schools of thought. And I don't even know how you would start digging into what would be best for you because they all seem kind of good.
I mean, there's so much overlap even within the school of thoughts. And then I feel the reality is like a lot of therapists draw from different schools of thought. Even watching Orna throughout the show Couples Therapy, now that I'm a bit more educated about what the actual schools of thought are, like the techniques, even though she doesn't use that jargon in the show, I kind of am like, oh, she's doing this here and she's doing this here. And she's actually like pulling in things from all sorts of different schools. So I think probably how I would change looking for a therapist now, like before I was like very much obsessed with like, does this person have the right credentials? Are they from the research-backed school of thought? Is there like scientific evidence that whatever they're practicing is going to actually like help? But I feel like it's probably actually more about like who you just click with. Totally. Like, I'm curious, your thing is so specific. What is it, like inter-family system?
Internal family systems, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you know you were looking for that? Or like, how did you even come across that? Was that just because you and Jerry clicked? And then it was like, okay, this also happens to be like what he practices.
Yeah, well, he's the therapist to all of my friends. So that's how I found him. They're like, no, he's amazing. Go to him. And I got very lucky. I was the last one in before he got off his client list because he's so popular. And
wow,
he's known as the therapist's therapist. So all of the local therapists go to him. And
oh my God, it's like Chapel Rowan, your favorite artist's favorite artist. Yeah. Jerry is the Chapel Rowan of therapy.
Oh, he's incredible. But it just worked for me from the get-go. And I was like, what the fuck is different about this? And then I realized it wasn't CBT. I was like, oh, okay. This is like a completely different type, but it's actually like helping me. So it was a happy accident. It was not intentional.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, okay, so I'm going to provide a broad overview of the types of therapy. Obviously, there's like so many. I'm not going to cover all of them, but the three most popular ones, and like these apply to both individual therapy as well as couples therapy, because the history of therapy and psychoanalysis started with the individual, and then it also got applied to couples eventually, right? So a lot of the underpinnings of these things are the same. So the three most common are emotionally focused therapy, integrative behavioral therapy, and then cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is what you were talking about. The limited therapy I have experienced was through CBT training. Like they explicitly said that. And I relate to your experience about it being like a very rational type of therapy, which also didn't really work for me because I'm like, it feels like there's a right answer. And like, if you're the kind of person who like can basically come to the right answer from a rational perspective, but then isn't necessarily acting out the right answer because emotionally it feels really different, then for me, at least, I didn't find it to be like very helpful.
Yeah, you live in your head, you're logical, you're type A. Like that's the exact reason I didn't work for me. So no, I can see that.
Yeah. So CBT centers around the notion that your thoughts influence your behaviors. And if you can identify the thought pattern, then you can change the behavior. Which, as we just shared from our own experience, may or may not be true.
Like, bitch, I can identify all day long. Nothing's changing, though.
Another type, integrative behavioral therapy. Even the language here is so similar to CBT, right? I was like, what is the difference? Behavioral therapy is more focused on, like, reinforcing positive behaviors and discouraging negative behaviors. I read so many articles being like, what is the difference? And like, it's more of just the emphasis. Think Pavlov's dogs. Literally, if you were like training a pet. And like, the focus is on these outward, observable behavior changes. And then the first one I mentioned, emotionally focused therapy. I wonder if this is kind of related to the therapy that you said you're doing, because this focuses on helping patients understand and regulate their emotions. At the end of the day, I mean, all of these are similar in that obviously you were supposed to recognize patterns, change your behavior. And so this one in particular is focused on the emotional, trying to improve attachment and bonding. A therapist might have you share a specific problem, event, conflict, and then rather than in CBT asking you like how you thought about it, they're just asking you like how you felt and like how did your emotions contribute to the situation.
Yeah.
Now, underpinning like all of these, of course, is a lot of buzzwords like attachment theory or like expressing love in different ways, right? And like all of these like kind of pop psychology. And so for me, I was still like, after reading about all these things, they still sound so similar. I don't really know the difference. And I think what helped me was thinking about how you process things maybe naturally and where you feel like you actually need more focused help. So I break them down into feeling, thinking, and doing. Feeling is the emotional focus therapy, thinking is cognitive behavioral therapy, and doing is integrative behavioral therapy.
Yep.
For me, like I've got the thinking down. And so then the question is feeling or doing? Do I have trouble understanding or accepting my emotions? Or like, is it that I do understand my emotions, I do understand my thoughts, but it's actually the doing that's hard, forming the habits that's hard. For me, at least, that's like maybe how I would think about differentiating if I was like actually looking to find someone who does subscribe to a particular school of thought. But other than these like most popular three, there's so many, right? And I think just touch on some others so that people get a sense for really the breadth here. And like, if you do have something specific, I think searching out something specific to meet your needs is definitely available and like worth doing the research. So the Gottman Institute, which we've mentioned already, like does have one. They focus specifically on the 4 horsemen of divorce, which I was also always like so skeptical of. Why are you just focusing on like divorce rather than the like holistic health of you guys as a couple?
Yeah.
In the survey that I referenced earlier, they asked people what type of couples therapy specifically they were doing, and Gottman only was 8%. So it seems like people share my skepticism. A couple other ones I thought were interesting. Narrative therapy focuses on the stories you and your partner tell yourself to shape your decisions and correcting those self-defeating or otherwise negative narratives that might be sabotaging you.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And then solution-focused therapy, couples who are exclusively looking to resolve a specific problem. That tends to be also a shorter form of therapy. There's, of course, sex therapy, right, which is a form of solution-focused therapy. And then finally, psychodynamic couples therapy. So I was really interested in this. And I feel like this kind of brings us into the second half of what we wanted to chat about, which is like looking at successful therapists out there, or at least the ones that have a public persona. Because Orna is a psychotherapist.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like watching the show and I was like, wow, she's amazing. How do I find someone like her? And Avery, my husband, when we were watching, he's like, what does that mean that she's a psychotherapist? And at the time I was like, oh, I think it means psychoanalysis like Freud, right? Like
Yeah.
things that are dealing with the unconscious. And while that's true, like that is the school of thought, I was surprised to learn like how much psychoanalysis has evolved since Freud. Because I also think about psychoanalysis as old-fashioned,
Mm-hmm.
male-dominated way of thinking where like the female is like a secondary sex compared to the man. And like a lot of like assumptions that like all your behavior is driven from the id and these repressed sexual urges.
Yep.
Both Orna and Virginia Goldner talk about this. They're psychotherapists, but they've updated psychotherapy. Virginia is part of this influential group of faculty at NYU called the Gang of Four, 4 women who've been instrumental in applying feminist theory to psychoanalysis. So for years, psychoanalysis was silent on the influence that culture has on the psyche. It was focused only on the private, the interior, but isn't the interior also shaped by the exterior world? Gender roles, patriarchy, heterosexuality being privileged, whiteness being privileged. And so she's bringing feminism, but also queer theory into psychoanalysis and like using that as a lens for understanding who we are as much as our internal development. Orna and Virginia are really similar because obviously Orna's clinical advisor on the show is also her mentor in real life. But yeah, I'm curious, you had mentioned at the beginning of the episode how watching Orna do therapy was like really different from your personal experience. It sounds like part of that could just be, it is a school of thought difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like she's using this psychotherapist perspective. What were some of the differences you noticed in terms of like her approach?
Orna is very attuned to what from the past is causing the present behavior. So she tries to get to the root of stuff. For instance, there's a couple where the wife was kind of on her husband's ass about responding to her while he was at work and like didn't want him to go out. And Orna was just questioning her. I'm like, well, what are you fearing when he goes out? And then we get to the root of that. She was involved in an incredibly abusive relationship that she wasn't recognizing was super abusive back when she was like 18 years old. So you get to the root of it that way.
Yeah. Basically peeling the onion, looking at, okay, here's how you're behaving, but like why? Peel back the onion and peel back the onion more and more. And this is the classic Freud stereotype. It is thinking about like you as a child and like when you were particularly vulnerable to systems that like shaped your world. How were you raised when your ego wasn't fully developed yet? What are all the things that maybe need to get unpacked there that you still live with as an adult that are underneath the surface, that are in your unconscious? And psychotherapy focuses on dialogue between the therapist and the patient. It's so different to like read about something in a book and be like, okay, this is how I should think versus someone like doing the work with you. And she's so integral in like helping the patient come to that realization through the way that she's like asking the questions and like giving them space.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal of psychotherapy is not just symptom relief, but achieving self-actualization where one can live fully beyond whatever is bothering them right now.
Yeah, that's such a grand aspiration.
But yeah,
I love it,
Yeah,
though.
yeah. By focusing on these early life events and experiences and how that impacts your behavior today, the goal is to like heal those psychological and emotional wounds so that, yeah, you just become healthier as a human rather than I feel like there's other forms of therapy I mentioned, which seem to be more around like, okay, maybe you're not like really getting at the root of the problem. You're just like developing techniques to cope or like
Yes.
techniques of like how to communicate.
Yeah, the psychotherapy thing and like what Orna and her clinical advisor, Virginia Goldner, talk about is, I feel like, not very accessible to the average person because, I mean, Orna was in school for 10 years. You have to get a
Yeah.
PhD. Like there's so much research and studying that goes into becoming a psychotherapist. And then you have like these other therapists that sometimes they're not even PhDs. They're just licensed, but they have these
Totally.
really accessible tools for us and like the books and the podcasts. And those are the therapists that I focused on. So first off, we'll start off with Terry Real. And I am reading his book right now. It's called Us, Getting Past You and Me to Build a More Loving Relationship. So he developed his own school of thought. Honestly, Terry Real like seems like a little bit of a narcissist in his book. The basis of his school of thought is that we come from not only a patriarchal and individualistic society that makes it really hard to be relational, but we also are so informed by our emotional wounds and past trauma, whether that be capital T or lowercase t trauma, is how he describes it. He's like, very few people have capital T trauma, but everyone has lowercase t trauma and like emotional wounds that inform us. And it splits us into these two different parts of ourselves that we carry with us. And one of them is the adaptive child who protected us from those wounds. And then you have the wise adult that you grew into. And unless you understand the behaviors of your adaptive child, it will take over the wise adult, especially when our prefrontal cortex is not working optimally because we are in a point of conflict and high stress with our partner. So he has a lot of tools in his book, and I haven't finished the book yet, but a lot of it is based on trying to figure out what your emotional wound is, how your adaptive child developed, and to understand it so you can put it on the back burner and let your wise adult come to the forefront. And he has this framework to think about our marriages, which is that we marry our unfinished business. Yeah, I know. So he believes that there's like these 3 stages of a relationship that we cycle through. They are harmony that devolves into disharmony and then repair. And then you can go through that many, many times, but often during that first disillusionment and disharmony stage, and this isn't just falling out of the honeymoon stage, this is like the first real relationship crisis that you go through. It's when you see all the imperfections of the other person. And that's when you realize like you're marrying your unfinished business. Like often that other person is the exact wounds that you are trying to heal in yourself, or they trigger the wounds in yourself. There's a reason that you guys are magnetically pulled together in this way. And then if you can learn to handle it, and if you can get past that, it's actually when you get true intimacy. To get past this, not only do you need to put the wise adult in charge, but you need to stop asking the question of who's wrong and who's right. That's where the individualistic patriarchal culture comes into play. And what matters more is how we as a team are going to make this work for both of us, which sounds very trite. But when you start digging into how our cultural patterns really ingrain in us, thinking about like asserting yourself and I'm right, I need to prove myself, and how that really works in like a work context, but not in a relational context, and like reframing your mind in your relationship to be more about us instead of the individual. It's the only path forward. So I've found the book quite interesting so far. Terry does seem a little full of himself at times, I will say, but
Do you know if his clients are mostly men?
I think they're mostly couples.
Okay. I see the roots of psychotherapy with the inner child stuff and like how a lot of your lowercase trauma happens when you're a kid. But then with the theme of the book, right? And like the concept of thinking about things more as a we versus an I feel like Orna and Virginia talk about this because of the patriarchy and because of gender roles. They would say that men would struggle to adopt this we mentality much more than a woman would, because the traditional masculine role is to assert and to lead the family or whatever, like make most of the decisions.
Yeah.
So that's why I was curious if he mostly was like talking to men with this advice.
I mean, when I was reading these chapters, I was like, oh, I don't necessarily like see these.
Yeah.
I'm not a perpetuator of patriarchy. I'm a victim of it. So
yeah.
So definitely, I think in those chapters, he's speaking more to men. So the second therapist that I looked at is one of my OGs, Esther Perel. I love her so much, but she comes at it from a very different perspective. A lot of her advice is more on passion and maintaining intimacy and eroticism in your relationship.
Does she identify as mostly a sex therapist?
No.
Okay.
No,
I feel like mostly she talks about sex. No?
I
don't listen to her as much though, so I could be off.
She does talk about sex a lot because her viewpoint is that it is a signal for emotional intimacy too. Like if your sex life is in the gutter, like that is just a symptom of a larger issue. And you can also like get to emotional intimacy through sexual intimacy. And that the lack of sexual intimacy can be the thing that breaks a relationship. Like it can be the thing that makes somebody go have an affair and then you have emotional problems. She also comes at it more from like an evolutionary lens. So just on like a pure biology level, it's something that we all need. So her tips on how to keep the passion alive, because obviously like when you get into a new relationship, like that's just there, right? Like it fizzles out sometimes eventually, but like you start with it. So like how do you maintain it is really the question. And she has these 3 themes that come up over and over again in her advice. And the first one is keeping the other alive. So what she means by this is that the otherness of another person is what's intriguing and erotic to us. It makes us curious. And over time, we kind of tend to mesh into one unit, one body. And that really kills that mystery and the intrigue in the other person. So you need to maintain some sort of distance to keep that spark alive and some sort of individuality. The second part that she talks about is novelty. So actually novelty in a relationship, she says, it breeds testosterone, it sparks your curiosity, and it encourages exploration. This curiosity feeds into that otherness too. Like the novelty makes the other person more other to you in this positive way. And then third, she really encourages play and curiosity for those same reasons. It sparks sexual intimacy and emotional intimacy. So just being curious about your partner, what their needs are when they come up with an emotion, instead of like going to the defensive or attack, you're coming from a place of curiosity and assuming that you don't know why they're upset or where it's coming from. So not only does that enforce the otherness of it, but when you're curious about somebody, they tend to bring their own walls down. So I thought that was a really interesting piece of advice. I'm like, that is so difficult to do in practice, but I can see how that could be a really essential piece to a happy relationship.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like both with Esther and Terry, they have quite strong perspectives on what is right or what is good, or like what healthy looks like.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
It sounds like she's saying preserving otherness in your partner is good. Like that's what you should be aiming for. Here are some techniques to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas my gut reaction to those kind of things is, okay, but is it? I don't know if I believe that. Whereas I feel like, obviously I'm most educated about Orna just because I've been like doing research specifically on her. She talks a lot about the fact that being in a relationship, you're constantly negotiating with otherness.
Yes.
Otherness being like literally someone who's different than you, the other person. I love that idea of negotiating because like there is no implicit value judgment in that.
Mm-hmm.
She's not saying like it's good that they're other and that can be like, exciting and sexy or that it's bad because obviously that is a primary driver of conflict. She's just saying like that is being in a relationship is like you're just constantly doing that. I feel like if you feel there's something lacking in your relationship, it might influence you on who you seek out in terms of these people with platforms or people who are giving essentially free therapy advice. Like you're not paying for it, but like you're consuming their content. I think that's maybe why I associated Esther Perel with sex because I feel like it tends to be people struggling with intimacy who tend to like go to her with problems because that aligns with her philosophy, even if it's not like she only deals with sex. But I wonder if over time as a therapist, your worldview kind of gets skewed if you have this reputation now for like a particular type of work. Because then the people who seek you out tend to already want your solution.
Totally.
These people who are creating methods, right? I wonder if it's just like Terry has a method because I'm sure it does work for his people, but like he's only seeing one scope of what's out there now.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. Orna calls it the presenting problem, right? What's the problem that you come into couples therapy with? And often the couples that are on even Esther Perel's podcast, like it is an affair or they haven't had sex in 5 years or one person's sex drive is vastly different than the other person's. It is sexual in nature, even if it's like a secondary or a tertiary problem, sex is involved.
Totally. Well, it's so fascinating because when we were talking about types of therapy, I was like, the differences between these types feel really small and nuanced. Mostly, it seems like they're the same. But then actually, when we're getting into at least the famous psychologists out there, their takes are so different.
Extremely
they really
different.
do have a niche. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to be aware of, even as a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
If you like to consume mental health content, who you're listening to is actually pretty important.
Totally.
I would have thought that like, oh, as long as I'm like listening to someone I like, I'm probably getting an unbiased or pretty broad view, at least, of the best psychological thinking out there. But really, it sounds like it differs a lot.
It does, yeah.
It would be so fascinating to put all these therapists in a room together and just see where they disagree and where they argue.
I need a new couples therapy show where we get a panel of therapists and we just have like Terry, Esther, Orna, who else? Like Brene Brown. I don't fucking know. Like so the top people.
Yeah. Or like, what if it's like that show Jury Duty? Have you seen that show?
No.
Oh my God, it's so good. Everyone's an actor except for one guy
Oh.
who thinks he's serving jury duty for real.
I've heard about it, yeah.
But what if the couples were actually actors and then they went to different couples therapists
Oh, fuck.
acting the problem, and then you see like how every therapist approaches the couple and like if they can help them resolve quote unquote their problem or not. That would be so interesting.
When is a producer going to reach out to us?
Yeah, seriously, I'd produce that.
I would produce that. To wrap us up here, I think the different types of couples therapy, they are so vastly different, but I think like the mosaic approach is probably the most effective. Like when I look at like just Terry's or just Esther's or even just Orna's, you're like, is this giving me everything I need? Especially if you're like trying to do it on your own and just like listen to somebody else's advice. I feel like you can get little nuggets of advice here and there from everybody and like not just get entrenched in like, well, if I'm more other, then I'll be more sexy to my boo and then all of our problems will be solved.
Right.
Like maybe not, maybe
Right.
not. Need a little bit of Terry in there, a little bit of Orna. But I just find this topic endlessly fascinating. I love watching other people's intimacy on screen in couples therapy. It's just the human mind is a fascinating, fascinating place. And so I'm very grateful to all the couples out there that like agreed to do that and like be so vulnerable on Showtime. So thank you for the entertainment. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see the other seasons.
Definitely.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye. If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Full transcripts and show notes are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.